Hi there, I'm Val McDermid and I write crime fiction and I write radio drama and I write all sorts of things. And today I am celebrating one of the joys of COVID, which is being able to communicate with people that I know and like and admire via the form of Zoom. And that means we get the chance to talk to each other. And today I'm talking to Gwen Adshead, who I just worship at the feet of. Um, Gwen, first time I heard you speak, made me admire you to this day was the compassion and the moral intelligence you bring to bear on your work. And what stuck in my mind from that first encounter was a single sentence that struck a profound chord with me. I even have my own Dr. Tony Hill quote it. He said, "Over the years, I've come to think of my patients as survivors of a disaster, where they themselves are the disaster, and my colleagues and I are the first responders." And for me, it's just a delight to be able to have these conversations with you across the ether that it would be difficult for us to organise in the flesh because we're at the opposite ends of the country.
That's absolutely right, Val. And I also remember very well our first meeting. We were at Radio 4, I think, one morning on Start the Week, and I'm a devotee of crime fiction for reasons that I think we'll go into in a little while. And I've always loved your work, and particularly your courage in dealing with very disturbed people and the dynamics of that disturbance. And it struck me, I think it's maybe struck many people, that there's something about crime fiction which is very much about morality tales. For society. They're a way for people to think about how do people get into states of mind that are cruel and unusual, for if we can steal a bit from the American Constitution. But I think that idea about cruel and unusual states of mind is something that everybody's interested in. But the great thing about crime fiction is that writers like yourself make those issues very live and accessible for all of us.
Yeah, but we also need places to go where we can find out the truth behind the headlines, if you like. And I mean, I think "Here Be Monsters" is the knee-jerk reaction of a lot of people to the kind of patients you deal with in your professional life. And in your book, The Devil You Know, you strip away all that sensationalism and you pull aside the curtain, I suppose, and show us those difficult and unvarnished truths. And we can see for ourselves the lives that are not bad or mad, but sad more than anything. And it begins with something that we both share, I think, the importance of story. And you actually have an epigraph on your book, if I can just quote it. It's an epigraph from Jung. "The reason for evil in the world is that people are not able to tell their stories."
Yeah, I know. And I think I was very fortunate. When I came to write the book, I was able to work with a professional storyteller. My dear friend and co-author Eileen is someone who's been working in an independent production, drama production, for many, many years. And her contribution was crucial for me to be able to take all the stories I've heard in my clinical practice and turn them into something that could be read by a non-professional audience. I was keen for my experiences and what I've learned from being a therapist working with violence perpetrators. I really wanted to try and get that out there into the general domain. And in that way, that's a point in which I guess my work touches with yours, or this, in which we're trying to create stories of people to make them come alive, but also to see the moral choices that they face, that actually there you use the word moral intelligence. And I think the best of crime fiction is like that. You know, it's about creating a story in which you're inviting you're inviting readers to engage with these profound moral dilemmas, as well as a cracking good story. And it's bringing those two together. Do you think?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, for me, one of I mean, there are, I guess, two big drivers in what I'm trying to do with my work. And that is to try and make sense of why people do the things that they do. I don't really subscribe to this notion that people are born evil and there's nothing you can do to change that fate. Because if that were to be the case, then what is the point of trying to improve people's lives? What is the point in trying to make things better if these evil people who are born bad are just going to come along and trash it anyway? I think that when people do terrible things, it is because of the circumstances of their lives, one way or another, they have found themselves in a place where what they are about to do or what they have just done makes sense to them. Although looking at it from the outside without attempting to understand it, it looks senseless, it looks mad, it looks incomprehensible. So I wanted to understand that for myself, but I also wanted to write books that wrote about people doing terrible things who were not doing it because they were evil, but because the circumstances in which they found themselves. And I guess I also wanted to write about the position of victims. When I first started writing, I'm going to read in a minute from my very first Tony Hill and Carol Jordan novel. But when I first started writing that series of novels, there was a slew of serial killer novels coming out of America, where the victims were simply cardboard cutouts who were only there to fulfill the function of being killed and mutilated and raped and strewn around the highways of America. They had no backstory, they had no life. And I wanted to write novels where the people who die, when they die, it matters. It matters to the reader that they have been killed. And it matters to the investigators in the book that these are individuals who have lost their lives. So those were the sort of informing principles, I suppose, that motivated me to begin with. And I had read Thomas Harris' first two novels, Red Dragon and The Silence of the Lambs, and been intrigued by the idea of offender profiling. And I thought it'd be interesting to try and write a book like that. And then I had an idea for it. But I then realized that in the UK, we don't do the thing that they do in America, where they train up FBI agents in what they call behavioral science. Here in the UK, when the police turn to the help in profiling a killer, they go to people like yourself, people who are practicing clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, therapists, who deal with serial offenders of one sort or another all the time. And that made me very excited, because I thought right from the start here, you've got an inbuilt dramatic tension between the two communities, the therapeutic community and the criminal investigation community. And that's where I started, really.
That really interesting different perspective about how those two communities may, in quotes, see the mind of the person who does these things, and how important it is perhaps for there to be a communication between them. And it makes me think of something that David Cantor, who's a leading criminologist, and as you and many people may know, was an early supporter of the idea of using psychological knowledge to profile people who'd killed. He talks about violence being a communication, a complex communication to the victim and to others, and that there's a complex relationship between perpetrator and victim. And I think that's really important, and that what you said about creating a story for the victim is really important. And it's interesting that you mentioned Thomas Harris, because actually in The Silence of the Lambs, in the film of The Silence of the Lambs, they do that. They do create a little bit of a backstory for one of the victims, and you see her driving off towards a meeting which is going to end terribly, and that suspense that's created, that you can do with narrative, you can do with story in a way that we don't always see. But why don't you read
Okay.
Val, and then we'll carry on.
I'm going to read from the sort of beginning of The Mermaid Singing, which was my first trip down the road of trying to write this kind of novel. It's a section from the killer's point of view, or person who will become the killer. And it's the first time I tried to do anything like this, and it was extremely scary writing it, because I just didn't know if I could do it in a way that was both convincing and authentic, I suppose. Anyway, here we go. You always remember the first time. Isn't that what they say about sex? How much more true it is of murder. I will never forget a single delicious moment of that strange and exotic drama. Even though now, with the benefit of experience and hindsight, I can see it was an amateurish performance, it still has the power to thrill, though not any longer to satisfy. Although I didn't realise it before the decision to act was forced upon me, I had been paving the way for murder well in advance. Picture an August day in Tuscany, an air-conditioned coach whisking us from city to city, a busload of northern culture vultures desperate to fill every moment of our precious fortnight's package with something memorable to set against Castle Howard in Chatsworth. I'd enjoyed Florence, the churches and art galleries filled with strangely contradictory images of martyrdom and Madonnas. After Florence, San Gimignano, the town rose up from the green Tuscan plain, its ruined towers thrusting into the sky like fingers clawing upwards from a grave. The guide burbled on about a medieval Manhattan, another crass comparison to add to the list we'd been force-fed since Calais. As we neared the town, my excitement grew. All over Florence, I'd seen the advertisements for the one tourist attraction I really wanted to see. Hanging splendidly from lampposts, gorgeous in rich red and gold, the banners insisted that I visit the Museo Criminologico di San Gimignano. Consulting my phrasebook, I'd confirmed what I thought the small print said: a museum of criminology and torture. Needless to say, it wasn't on our cultural itinerary.
Thank you so much, Val. There's just so much there, I think, for the forensic psychotherapist to enjoy in particular, as well as the ordinary detective reading aficionado like myself. And I suppose there are those two things that struck me right at the beginning, is that I'm sure you were right, that people who become, as it were, committed to killing do think about their own performance. And I think that performative quality, that kind of spectacular kind of display is clearly, I think, important for some of our people who kill, and who kill in very dramatic ways. I'm thinking of some of our more lurid, some of the more lurid kinds of killings that have taken place in the last couple of years that we've seen, and where, you know, things are done to the body and that sort of thing, and dismemberments and stuff like that. And there's something about what the spectacle that's being created, and how your killer is thinking about how his performance, his or her performance, is going to be appreciated. But I also love the way you talk about how they feel that their decision to kill is forced upon them, because I think this issue of passivity is really important. How many people I've met who are keen to tell me that they're not a bad person, they just had no choice when this or the other happened to them, and things happened to them, so they felt they had no choice, that they had to act. And I think that's really interesting. I've never met someone who said, you know, I got up this morning, I just felt I had to kill somebody, it's a good thing, and off I go. I haven't met anybody ever, you know, whether in prison or in secure hospitals, who said, you know, it's a good thing to do this, and off I go. People are always at pains to tell me that they really felt they had no other choice at the ultimate moment.
Yeah, and that's where those stories come in that are so compelling, that the ones that you share with us in the book as well, and the ones that we try to create in our fictions, that we have this sense of inevitability almost, and we're all very good at post hoc rationalization of the things that we do that we're afterwards ashamed of or embarrassed about. And I think this is kind of ratcheting that up to the nth degree, that there has to be somewhere in our heads, so that we can live with ourselves, a sense of justification for actions that we've taken.
Yes, no, I think I think that's absolutely true. And it really goes to the point that you were making earlier, which I absolutely agree with, that I don't think I have ever met anybody who was, quotes, born evil, for whom, you know, being bad was, whatever that means, was there all through their childhood and was inevitable. I think much more I meet people where all the opportunities for repair and restoration and reconciliation and rehabilitation, when all those opportunities get taken away, and this person is then left in a kind of internal landscape which is bleak, and where there only seem to be a few dreadful black and white options, and that sometimes the killing is a kind of dreadful act of survival. Yeah,
and I think for me as a writer, writing from the perspective of a character who's inhabiting that kind of space in their head, it's quite difficult to get into that space. And I think for me, anyway, once I start writing in that voice, I have to write all the killer sections, if you like, on first, because I don't want to step out of that voice and step back into it in my writing life. So with the Mermaid Singing, for example, which has two alternating voices, as a first person point of view that we heard there, and then there's also a multi-point of view third person narrative, and they have different time frames as well. So the killer's narrative starts before the main third person narrative starts. So in order to try and balance that, to try and keep myself in the right place, if you like, both in time and space, as well as in the head of the person I was writing from, I did write all of those sections first, and then sort of slotted them in as I went through the rest of the story, and more or less they stayed more or less the same, actually, as I wrote the rest of the book.
Mm. And you're making me think, this may seem like an odd analogy, but you're making me think of C.S. Lewis talking when he wrote the Screwtape Letters, from the perspective of a senior devil tempting a junior devil or advising a junior devil, and saying how hard he found it to write in that voice and how exhausting it was and how he didn't much like being there, which is one of the reasons that he didn't ever write an extended sequel. And I'm full of admiration for people like yourself who do step into that world and write from the first person perspective of someone who's killed, because I think it is very difficult for those of us who have not lived in that world to imagine it and to put words to it. And I certainly found it quite difficult just in the couple of chapters in The Devil You Know, trying to write offending from the offender's perspective. And that was particularly the case for the one person who had been downloading child pornography, and for another, someone who'd sexually abused his son. I think being able to step into that person's perspective and think in their voice, I think that's demanding. I think that's demanding.
I mean, in one sense, it's essentially the same process. Whatever character you're creating in your head, you're walking in somebody else's shoes. You have to try and look at the world through their eyes. Think about what made them the person they are. What kind of backstory does a person who's doing these things have? What shaped them? What do they love? What do they hate? What's their idea of a good night out? Where would they go on their holidays? All of these kind of things feed into the sense of who the person is, whether they're your protagonist or your antagonist. But there's no doubt there are some spaces that are less comfortable to occupy than others, and finding yourself inside the space of somebody who is about to or has committed terrible things is undoubtedly more stressful. Although for me, the great solace is that I can walk out of my office and know that nothing bad is going to happen until I sit down at the desk again. I know I've just made this stuff up. So I think that the impact on me psychologically and emotionally has to be infinitely less than the impact on you of sitting in a room hearing these stories directly.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because when you were talking just then, it made me think of something that Eileen and I had tried to sort of to elaborate on in the book, which is this idea of a kind of radical empathy, in which you get up close to the mind of somebody who's done something terrible, but you also maintain a kind of compassionate distance so that it doesn't hurt you too much, but also so that you can keep the victims in mind, just like you were saying earlier on. But one of the things that we tried to describe in the book is how that practice of a kind of radical empathy is just that. It's a practice. It's kind of a daily practice. And it takes a bit of an investment of time and attention. And you have to keep working away at it, because you have, unless you keep a kind of distance, this work could overwhelm you, and then you wouldn't be any use to anybody. So and I'm wondering if that's a good point for me to. I might read a little bit from the introduction.
Yes, please.
Of The Devil You Know. So this is just right at the beginning, just setting the scene. In that distant time, when people on aeroplanes used to talk to each other, I'd sometimes get asked what I did for a living. I'm a psychiatrist and psychotherapist who works with violent offenders, I would reply. Mild curiosity would shift to amazement. You mean you actually talk to those people. This could lead to an impromptu lecture about what a waste it was to bother with such monsters. Or I'd get a bit of a bemused, but they can't be helped. Aren't they born that way? The occasional British fellow traveller might lean in and offer sotto voce, frankly, I think Parliament ought to bring back hanging. Nowadays, on the rare occasions when anyone starts up a chat while we're out fastening our seatbelts, I'm inclined to tell them I'm a florist. But I think that everyone who is both fascinated and repelled by human cruelty deserves a better and more honest response about the treatment of violence and those who perpetrate it. And that is my aim in this book.
And it's a name you deliver on, I have to say. But, you know, I remember being struck by something that you also said, your favorite question as a therapist. If this was a story, where would it start? So where did this book start? Where did the idea for this book start?
Well, I had been wanting to try and write a book about evil for a long time, partly because I got asked to give talks about evil, because it's inevitable that people like you, people like me who work in this world, who try and understand how people come to let themselves do terrible things, and the justifications, that very important word, the justifications they use to get themselves there, I thought raised all sorts of very interesting questions about these very ancient philosophical and theological ideas about evil, which everyone has an interest in. Judges use the word, tabloid press use the word. If you type in evil into Amazon, thousands and thousands of titles come up. So it's an issue that everyone's interested in. So I've been giving talks about this for a while, and I thought, well, I'm going to try and write a book about this, but I want to write a book for a general audience, not for professionals. And I had this rather grandiose, it was really grandiose idea about putting together bits from theology and literature and philosophy and I just couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't get the voice right. It was either very lectury and dry, or it was a bit all over the place, really. And so I was moaning to Eileen about how I couldn't get this book going. And I think probably sort of slightly maddened by my incompetence, Eileen said, well, why don't I help you? Why don't I help you? And why don't we build it around stories of people? And as we began to talk about it, it became clear to me that this would also solve a bit of a problem that I was struggling with, which was about confidentiality and privilege. Because clearly the people I've met over the years, their suffering, what both their own and what they've caused, is not available for entertainment. So I had to find a way to take what I'd learned from listening to them to create it into stories, and Eileen could do that for me because of her experience. So between us, we were able to craft some stories that were protective of the confidentiality for both perpetrators and victims, but also created real, clinically real, authentically real people, which are a sort of kind of mosaic picture of people I've seen over the years.
Yeah, and it's really interesting reading it because, like my years first as a journalist and then as a writer of fiction made me aware of a lot of cases over the years. And there's the odd moment where I think, oh yeah, that sounds a bit like such and such, but the rest of the character, the rest of the events are clearly not that story being retold. So I think you've done a very good job of camouflaging those histories. And you make a really good point there at the beginning, I think, about voice. Voice is so important, I think, when you're telling a story, whether it's fiction or non-fiction. It's finding that right tone. And I've done both fiction and non-fiction, and when I'm writing a novel, getting the voice is the start for me of being able to tell the story. And when I'm writing non-fiction, which I have done a couple of times, it's finding that way, a voice that will communicate the information you want to communicate in a way that's palatable to the reader, without reducing what you're trying to say to triviality. And that's a real balancing act, I think, and particularly for someone with your own background in writing academic stuff. I mean, I know you've published a lot of papers over the years in academic texts, and that's a very, very different style. Did you have a sense of what the voice was that you were trying to find?
Yes, I wanted to have a kind of companion, a kind of let me walk with you and come with me and see what I see kind of a voice. So not, I hope, your dry tour guide on the coach, but a kind, although it's a lovely image, Val, and it's a nice example too of the people on the coach are not who you think they are. But I think something about, I find the people that I meet and the world that I work in extraordinary and compelling, and it's always interesting. Come and see what I see, and come and see if that changes your mind, perhaps about some of the concepts that we all sort of think we know about, for example, like evil, particularly like murder. Are all murderers evil? Surely once you've committed a murder, you're always a murderer. That idea that I was particularly keen to try and challenge the idea that once you've done a terrible thing, that somehow sticks around you. You're fixed in a kind of narrative amber, and you're never going to be able to step out of that. And yet so many of the people I meet want to say, well, that was then, but I'm a different person now, and I really want to be and live a different person coming. I want a different story now to the one that was then.
And you're right, absolutely. I mean, it's such a powerful point that there are some things that you're never allowed to move on from. And you've got one of the people that you quote in the book says you can be an ex-bus driver, but you can never be an ex-murderer. And that's. Do you think that's a social construct?
Yes, I do. I do. I do think it's a social construct, and I also get it in a way. There is, I think that was the other thing that I was keen to try and get across, that I do understand. I do completely understand why people are frightened and vengeful and angry with people who've done horrible things. It would be madness to not understand that, and a serious failure of empathy too. So I get why, in a way, that identity is sticky. But the trouble is that it is a misunderstanding, I think, of sometimes about how homicide can arrive after what I remember one of my patients saying, 30 seconds of madness. And he didn't mean that he was mentally ill at the time. He meant that he had really lost sight of reality just for a moment, just for a few moments. And then after that, everything was changed. And I guess I do feel pretty passionately that there is, that everybody needs a chance, needs a second chance, that everybody needs a shot at redemption.
That's one of the joys of writing serious fiction. You get the chance to give people a little bit of redemption, a little bit of rehabilitation, a little bit of possibility, potential for change. And you talk quite a bit about how we all have the capacity to change our minds, but that feels risky sometimes to us. It feels like giving something up, like we're conceding something. And I'm intrigued by what you say about it being easier to do this in group therapy, that patients almost become each other's therapists. Do you think that as writers, we can become readers' therapists? I'm thinking of the way that during the COVID lockdown, so many people turned to reading for consolation, for escape, for safety, for whatever. And do you think that somehow that we writers can actually fulfill that sort of function?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm confident that the reason that stories are essential to the identity of human beings, we're homo narrans, aren't we? We've been telling stories ever since we got upright and had big enough brains to do so, and that we've been telling stories, and they're a way of making sense of our world and our relationships with people. And they remind us that we are part of a bigger story, a wider story of people that we connect to. And I think the wonderful thing about stories and literature in general is that who is it? I think it might be C.S. Lewis again, or it might be Somerset Maugham. We read to know that we're not alone. So that you pick up a book and you read and you say, somebody else feels the same way as I do. And that's exactly why we set up a group for people who killed, because we felt that they were often people who found themselves almost like exiles from any kind of community. So to be able to join a group with other people who'd had that lived experience it was something that could make them feel that they were connected to other people. They weren't inhuman or anti-human. They were human beings who had made the most dreadful and catastrophic of errors, one that would change their life forever. And so creating a life after death was you're going to need other people to do that. But I think the link with COVID is really interesting, Val, because in lockdown, people were often at home frightened of death. There was a kind of idea that death is outside and I can't go out in case I die. And I remember hearing someone on the radio talking about, I'm not going outside when there's a killer virus out there. And I think that made me think about how frightened we are of something coming along and taking our life away. And actually being able to read, keeping your mind means that you're keeping your mind open. And I wonder if detective stories, detective fiction, crime fiction is particularly important as an invitation to readers to open up your mind.
Yeah, it's a kind of consolation as well, a detective novel, that even though all these terrible things are happening, Tony Hill or Karen Pirie or Ali Burns will come along and make it better somehow, or at least bring some kind of resolution and some kind of possibility of something redemptive at the end of it. And I think there's very definitely that consolation in those books. And it is, I mean, I remember P.G. James talking about this a lot, that it is essentially a moral landscape, that ultimately bad things happen to people who do bad things. But the converse is not always true. The good do not always end well. And the notion of the happy ending in the detective novel is one I find quite troubling, because frankly, how do you find a happy ending after all these things that have gone on in these pages? I don't know, but there are certainly moments where you feel that you can give your characters some sort of possibility of difference. And I'm interested too, but with the writings of people like yourselves who are professionals in this field of forensic psychiatry, forensic psychology, but also forensic science generally, who've opened a lot of windows and doors on what was really something we knew very little about as professional writers. And I think that there's been a profound influence coming from those writings that tell us the truth, if you like, or a truth about what lies behind the crimes that happen. And that's kind of given us more scope as writers to write more authentically and with more articulacy, I suppose, about what our chosen subject is. I'm thinking in particular, a lot of the understanding we now have of violence in adult lives is rooted in childhood trauma. And you write a lot about the childhood traumas that have led your patients, your people, to the places in which they find themselves. And it seems to me that it's no coincidence that we've had in recent years a slew of what we call domestic noir or domestic suspense, novels that are rooted in female narratives usually, and have their roots in the past abuse, and a lot of it comes back to childhood. And I don't think that those books could have been written 20 years ago, because we didn't have the access to the information to give us the understanding to write them from the inside. So that's been, I think, an important area of cross-fertilization.
Yes, very much so. And actually it reminds me of a conversation that, an interview I heard you do earlier in the year, where we were talking about the motivations for killing. And I hope that you and other crime writers will be pleased to know that many forensic psychiatrists in training read a lot of detective fiction, because I think that the fictional world does invite us to think about motivations in a complex way. Because as you know, that quite often there's a bit of a legal focus on, does this person have a mental illness or not? But actually that's not very interesting. And again, in crime fiction, it's a bit of a cop-out, isn't it? Where, he killed because he was mad is not much of a solution. And I think that's really interesting. So I think understanding the motivations for killing is something that crime fiction can really instruct forensic professionals about, to help them look deeper and broader into why this person came to let themselves do what they did. But then I think, as you say, there's been something about trying to open up for the general readership what happens after What happens after you've identified your perpetrator and justice is about to be done now? It often ends, doesn't it, with the arrest and the trial will happen. And I guess what we were trying to do a little bit in The Devil You Know is take people to a place is what happens after that. The trial has happened, the person's been found guilty, they've been sent to prison or sometimes sent to a hospital. And what happens then? And I think there's something about sharing those experiences that I hope is that kind of cross-fertilization. But I think it is a dialogue that is rich, potentially rich for the fiction writers and the non-fiction writers to have a kind of space, a bit like we're doing now, Val, I think, to trade ideas, to think about how we can enrich ourselves in our writings.
Yeah, and that kind of brings me back to this notion of collaboration. I mean, you wrote this book with Eileen's help to find the voice, to shape the stories. And I've done various projects in recent years that have involved collaboration. I did a sound and light installation in Edinburgh, which projected a short story that I'd written onto buildings all around the city. I did a radio drama that was turned into a graphic novel. And I've done various bits and pieces of working directly with other people, working with people who are adapting my work for television. And that has taught me a lot about their process, has taught me a lot about how I can steal from them to make my own solo work better, if you like. Do you feel that working with Eileen to write something that's more generally accessible has made other things possible for you in terms of how you do what you do?
Yes, definitely. I think it has deepened my attention to the dialogue and conversation. It's changed the way also that I teach. I'm lucky to work with trainees, junior and senior trainees in psychiatry. That's a real privilege for me. And writing the book with Eileen and thinking about narrative in the way that we've been talking about, I think has deepened my attention to that and the importance of sharing that with the next generation of psychiatrists so they can start to think in a more narrative, more relational, more dialogic kind of way when they come to do their assessments, that they approach this person as a person who they're meeting in the middle of their lives. As Dante said, in the middle of my life, I found myself in a dark wood for I'd lost my way. And that's when the forensic psychiatrist comes in and says, how are you lost? How did you get here? How is it that you've lost your way? And rather than, are you hearing voices? Are you depressed? That kind of a thing.
Yeah, and I mean that to me is kind of the takeaway from always from our conversations is what we can give each other, what we can learn from each other, the sort of stimulus that talking to each other brings from the fictional and non-fictional worlds. But I remember you saying that you had an ambition to write a really good detective novel. Before we go, can you tell me where you're up to with that one?
Well, that reminds me of that famous old joke about, no, I can't remember how it goes exactly. It's about, how's your writing going? No, neither am I, So it's always work in progress, but the idea of creating a storyline and a plot, it clearly begins with plotting, doesn't it, Val? At some level.
It begins with story. I mean,
Yes.
It always comes back to story. What always starts me going is story. I have somebody says something and it connects with something in the back of my head, and I think there's a story here.
Yes.
And so story is where it starts, and then you build the character and the plot around that basic story that you have.
Yeah.
And you can do that.
Well,
you can do that. I know you can do that.
Well, Eileen and I are thinking about it. We're thinking about it. I think we've got an idea for a story, but it's about how we make it work. And because it's a world that I don't know the creation or that fictional created, but it feels more provisional. It feels like it's a bit of a tiptoeing up to the start. But I must say, it would be. I'd really like to, because it's just such a fantastic medium, really, for elaborating people.
You've done the apprenticeship. You've done the reading. That's where you start. Is the
that's
reading.
Where you start. That's true.
We all start as readers.
Yes. No, that's absolutely true. Thank you, Val. I really appreciate that. That from the master. Thank you.
Yes. And on that note, we'll say goodbye and go gently into that good night, as it were.
Good heavens, Val. Okay, take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you.